rest. Last week, if you recall from the podcast, Bishop Marianne Buddy reminded us that the commandment to rest goes all the way back to the beginnings of our faith tradition, a beginning we share with Jews and Muslims as well, as recorded in the biblical stories of creation. In the creation stories, God created the heavens and the earth, all the creatures of the earth, and humankind in just 6 days. And then he rested on the seventh day, and in doing so created a day of rest. Our guest presenter today is Rabbi Jason Klein. Unfortunately, Rabbi Sim Glazer was not able to join us today, but we wish him well and are so pleased to welcome Rabbi Klein with us. He's going to explore some of the background of rest and the concept of rest and Sabbath, especially in the Jewish faith and tradition. Rabbi Klein has an amazing biography, and I could spend most of our hour together just talking about his background. It was quite remarkable, I think, that he is able to join us this morning. He was chosen in 2013 to head the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association as the first openly gay man to head a national rabbinical association. He's also the first Hillel director to hold the presidency. Where he served as Hillel director and rabbi was at the University of Maryland in Baltimore. And he's also served as director of the Center for Jewish Life at JCP downtown, the Jewish Community Project of Lower Manhattan. In 2018, he came to the Twin Cities, no doubt, because he was looking for warmer weather, to serve as director of lifelong learning at Temple Israel, Minneapolis. And we warmly welcome him to our Faith Forum Hour. So if you would please mute. If you have questions, don't hesitate to pop them into chat, or Rabbi Klein may have, if he wishes to ask, if you wish to ask him a question, I'm sure he'd be grateful as well. So if you would do so, let us pray. Loving God, thank you for putting people in our lives to remind us of the sacred practice of rest. Help us find time and energy to pull away from our days, sit quietly and feel and know your healing and renewing love for us. Amen. So over to you, Rabbi Klein. And again, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much. What an honor to be here. How's the sound? Is okay? Great. So I think I want to start by moving away from the concept of rest, because I wouldn't be I don't know, there's some sort of stereotype about the multiplicity of opinions in the Jewish community, and I want to start by kind of going back to that biblical narrative that Ed referred to. I like to think that after those 6 days of creation, that mostly what God did was stop. And the word Shabbat that we commonly translate as Sabbath today is more about stopping than about resting. And I think for me, sometimes that's a helpful framework to just kind of like shift the way that we think. We sort of often think in language, and sometimes a small tweak in language can also open up worlds for us. I want to encourage us when we think about Shabbat and the idea of Sabbath to think about, like, what is it that was happening during the week that we're stopping, and then what might we start again in the week ahead, and also what are some of the opportunities in that, maybe challenges in that, of course, too, since sometimes we're so tethered to our weekday work that it's hard to make those breaks. So look, it seems like it makes sense to start with the Bible. I know in the history of the Anglican Church, there's certainly from my perspective, I don't know if the word is a tension or a balance of being, I wasn't here to give a class in Anglicanism, but a biblically based tradition while still having tradition, reason, some say experience, right, as part of this way that people come to understand things. So I think a similar thing happens in Judaism, where we have biblical texts and we understand them through the lens of Jewish tradition. And for us, that means the sages of the Talmud first and foremost, and then also the way they've been handed down to us through legal texts, through storytelling, and through practice. So when I think of biblical sources for Shabbat, I do first and foremost think of the first creation story, the story in which God finishes creating all the things God has made. God stops on the seventh day, and God sanctifies the seventh day. It strikes me in that story that seems to be all about God, not so much about us. Yeah, humanity was created on day 6, according to the story, and we're created in God's image. So I suppose if you do one of these kind of transitive properties of equality or whatever it's called in math, then maybe we created in God's image are also supposed to stop. Maybe we're also creating, which is another tradition, right? That we're God's partners in the ongoing creation of the world. But I think on the surface level, that text is very much about God. We don't really get texts about human beings until later on in the tradition of the Torah. So as we move forward in the biblical tradition, it's not until after the Exodus from Egypt that we see Shabbat again. We see the idea of gathering a double portion of manna in the wilderness on Fridays, so that we have enough for the seventh day as well. So there, I think, through the storytelling about our actions, we hear that not only are we not going to do something on Shabbat, which is gather manna, but we are going to do something to prepare for Shabbat, right? That somehow, in order to stop, in order to rest, if you will, maybe sometimes we do a little extra to remind ourselves of the transition between the regular work week and rest. As we keep moving through the biblical tradition, we get to Mount Sinai and the Decalogue, and in the book of Exodus, we hear what we Jews would call the fourth of the Decalogue at Mount Sinai. Zachor Yom HaShabbat L'Kadshо, remember the Sabbath day to sanctify it. There's a parallel text in Deuteronomy when we hear Shamor Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho, keep the Shabbat day. So we have remember and we have keep. And so a lot is made of kind of the difference between these two words. And there's a kind of a beautiful, sort of almost mystery, if you will, of the idea that as God speaks the Decalogue, that God is saying Shamor and Zachor in one utterance, is saying keep and remember right at the same time. So what does it mean to both keep and remember? Some would say that the keep part is the things that we don't do in order to have a day of rest, and the remember part are the things that we do. Some would say that the keep part is what we actually do or don't do on Shabbat, on the day of rest itself. And some would say that the remember part is the rest of the week, that in the other 6 days, we're counting from Shabbat and towards Shabbat, and that Shabbat becomes kind of the fulcrum of the experience of the week. But there's this nice idea that somehow each telling of the Decalogue, first at Mount Sinai and then in kind of Moses's 30-odd chapter speech of the book of Deuteronomy, that these are somehow one and the same. Interestingly, in one version, there's a reference to God creating the heavens and the earth and resting on the seventh day. So there we now have the explicit connection between the creation story and the idea of us resting. And in the other story, there's more of a reference to the Exodus from Egypt. So in a way, Shabbat becomes both a symbol of the world when it was perfect at the very beginning of creation, if you will, or at least maybe we like to imagine it so. And when the world is messed up, as certainly a story about hundreds of years of slavery would indicate, that the world is getting better, right? That somehow the idea of both creation and the idea of redemption, of going from a particularly problematic situation to a better world, each of those is connected to Shabbat. So it's some more symbolism about it. Finally, in terms of this, I think the most significant mentions of I suppose there's also a mention about somebody carrying sticks outside, and that is not looked on particularly favorably. But I think the person is executed. But I think the last reference that probably shapes the Jewish understanding of Shabbat the most is also in the book of Exodus, and it follows the instructions for building the Mishkan, the tabernacle in the wilderness. It's toward the end of chapter 31 of Exodus, and it says, "V'shamru v'nei Yisrael Shabbat." The Israelite people will keep Shabbat, observing Shabbat through the ages as a covenant of time between me and the children of Israel. It will be a symbol, for in 6 days God made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day God stopped and was refreshed. So another reference back to creation. And I think as the sages of the Talmud read the Bible, read the Torah, they really look to the placement of that verse in Exodus as a place to understand like what we're ceasing from. And what gets read into it in Jewish tradition is that everything that came before we're ceasing from. So in order to make a tabernacle in the desert, you have this huge community effort of giving donations, of sewing and writing and building, all these kinds of things. And our sages categorize what it takes to build the tabernacle into 39 different categories of work. And because we're told to keep Shabbat right after the commandment to build the tabernacle, right, there's a sort of hermeneutic principle that because the Torah tends to be so sparse, something omitted, something double, the exact placement of something is significant in interpretation. So placing the idea to keep Shabbat right after the description of the tabernacle led our sages to understand that what you do to build the tabernacle is what you have to stop doing on Shabbat. So if you know Jews who might not use money on Shabbat or light a fire, cook, sew, write, these kinds of things, it's coming from that understanding of what we're to cease doing on Shabbat. That said, there are a lot of things that over time we learn that we are to do on Shabbat, and that part of this idea of a day of Shabbat, a day of rest, of stopping, is delight. So eating 3 formal meals instead of maybe sometimes we have that quick breakfast on the run or whatever it is. Friday evening, Saturday noontime, and an additional meal before it gets dark again on Saturday evening. That's one of the big do's. So is all sorts of other joy, whether that's sex, whether that's singing, whether that's dancing, whether that's learning, time with family. These are all among the ways to make Shabbat delightful. I suppose it's worth saying, though it may be obvious, that that same creation story sets the foundation for how we understand a day in Jewish tradition. So that because the text says there was evening and morning, there was evening and there was morning, not the other way around. We start each day with the sun going down. So when we approach Shabbat, we're approaching Friday when the sun goes down. There's a tradition to light candles before the sun goes down. I understand this as a way of extending the day into the night, particularly before there was electricity harnessed for us to use. So we have a longer night, right? I guess sort of back in the day, and also for people who are farmers today in an agrarian society, the procedure was generally like, wake up, pray, have a meal, work, maybe stop and pray in the middle, have another meal, pray again, go to sleep. And so 3 daily prayers. Jill was referring to the daily office earlier, right? So we can have this tradition in Judaism of a morning and afternoon and nighttime prayers each day. And Shabbat was distinguished because there was not work to wake up for the next day, and people could stay up late. And in order to do that, we want to see each other. So this tradition to light Shabbat candles before Shabbat begins and take advantage of their light during Shabbat, when it's traditionally forbidden to kindle or put out flames. There's also other symbolism, like when we talk about Jewish Shabbat experience, like at the meals themselves, wine and bread tend to be the backbone of the meal. Certainly, this is something that we see in altar-based Christian traditions as well, but sometimes we talk about those being particularly special foods because among all foods, they may be the ones in which the partnership between the divine and human is so pronounced, right? We're not just grabbing sheaves of wheat and eating them off which is a process to make flour, to make bread. We're taking what the universe gives us and kind of elevating it in a way. And some would say that winemaking is a similar kind of process. So after prayers, whether it's in synagogue services or personal services, Friday evening, when one sits to have the communal meal, it begins usually with wine or grape juice, over which the prayers sanctifying Shabbat said. So most Jewish communities have the quote from the creation story that we keep coming back to about God resting, God stopping, sanctifying, and then another blessing that refers to Shabbat as a reminder of creation and of the Exodus. So the wine becomes kind of a tool over which we sanctify Shabbat, and begin a meal with bread as well. Often people use braided challah bread for this. So I think, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel talked about Shabbat as an island in time. So kind of take the idea of the most beautiful island, tropical, whatever it is, Lake of the Isles, whatever your go-to island is. I live near Lake of the Isles in Minneapolis, and try to imagine what that is in time rather than in space, and what opportunity there is to kind of dwell in that space for 25 hours a week. So I think part of what also happens is that Shabbat itself becomes particularly special time. And then as Shabbat begins and as Shabbat ends, we also have these periods of liminal time because there's this, the tradition is that the day ends at sunset, and the new day begins at sunset. Because Shabbat is so special, many traditional communities will wait until it's dark outside, until you can see the stars, for Shabbat to be over. So Shabbat lasts more like 25 and 24 hours. But that period between sunset and dusk is also understood as kind of an auspicious period of transition. And likewise, so is the beginning of Shabbat. The mystics in the land of Israel in medieval times would it said kind of welcome Shabbat in the fields, which to me sounds very romantic, pastoral. I'm not sure what the right word is. But if you think of them as farmers, in a way, they were welcoming Shabbat where they worked, right? So imagine what it would be like if you are like showing up to a physical workplace and you kind of began your Shabbat prayers there, and only then kind of made your way home, as if to say even the place of where we work in itself is kind of given this sense of sanctity each week. One of the things I love about Shabbat is this idea that that time controls us, as opposed to we controlling time. And I think that in the framework of just the environmental calamities that have been wreaked upon the earth by humanity, I think there's something that's really nice and centers the idea of modesty, of humility for human beings to say, no matter what happens during the week, when the sun sets on Friday, it's Shabbat. Whether I've planned for it, whether I haven't planned for it, wherever I am, whatever I'm doing or not doing, something bigger is happening in the universe than I. The hymn, also created by out of Jewish mystical schools in Tzfat in the land of Israel, roughly 450, 500 years ago, that most Jewish communities around the world sing to welcome Shabbat as part of distinguishing the Friday evening service from other services, every other evening services each week. It's called Lecha Dodi. There's a line in it in which Shabbat is called Sof Ma'aseh B'Machshavat Chila, the last, sorry, the last thing made, but the first in mind. So if we go back to what Ed said at the beginning, right, 6 days of creation, however you imagine those days in our sacred story, and then God stops, rests, sanctifies, right? So in this tradition, I think, of Lecha Dodi, the author is saying, well, the world might seem like it was created for humanity. We're told in the same narrative to be fruitful, to multiply, to have some kind of dominion over the earth, fill the earth, have dominion over it. But just in case you thought that this was all about you, actually, the whole purpose of creation was Shabbat, not human beings. And I love that. I mean, I think that humanity could kind of use a dose of that collectively, and at least a lot of the humanity that I get to experience, in my life. So a few other framing concepts. One of which is, when Shabbat begins, I mentioned that some of the quotes in our prayers and the Kiddush prayer over wine, saying that Shabbat is special. We talk about the creation story, and in the morning, at services on Shabbat morning, we read from the Torah directly from the scroll, and so there's a sense there that we're kind of the Shabbat at Mount Sinai. We're kind of mini reenacting being at Mount Sinai and hearing the Torah presented once again. So in a way, we start with the Shabbat of creation, and then we're at the Shabbat of revelation. So as the philosopher Franz Rosenzweig might talk about, like we kind of have this triangle in a way of creation, kind of the world as it is made, given to us, revelation, kind of the tools that we have to operate in the world. And if we use those tools well, then presumably we get to redemption, right? We get to a world that is more perfected, a messianic age, if you will. So Shabbat afternoon service is the last service toward the end of Shabbat. Actually has imagery of imagining the patriarchs, matriarchs in the biblical tradition observing Shabbat. Now, let's be clear. There's nothing specific in the surface meaning of the Torah that says that Abraham and Sarah observed Shabbat. There may be more interpretive ideas liking to imagine they did, but it imagines the patriarchs or matriarchs being joyful, singing out, imagining kind of a world in which everyone, living and dead, has been born, hasn't been born, was born, observing Shabbat. So in a sense, there's a way in which Shabbat is supposed to be a foretaste of the world to come. So whether the world to come means the world after we die, whatever that might look like, or whether the world to come means the world like this world as it will become in time by us working to make it better, or some intriguing combination of those things. There's a sense that Shabbat gives us a little taste of that. Me'ein olam haba is like just from a little bit of the world to come. So these days, different Jews from different perspectives and experiences who may want to take the idea of observing Shabbat seriously do so in all sorts of different ways. Some are as scrupulous as possible to follow these 39 don'ts that we talked about being read from the sages in the Talmud, right out of the Torah. Some people also maybe try something new or different, or aren't following those details to the letter, but they're trying to find things that feel like they're in the spirit of stopping or resting. In my rabbinate, I've probably never told someone what to do or not to do on Shabbat, except I'll always tell kids not to do homework, because that just seems so clear that's a nice thing to take a break from. But yeah, I mean, there are for families who have less of a chance to be together around the table during the week, or just doing something leisurely, Shabbat is a great time for that. Some families are going to want to get into the car and go to the zoo and appreciate nature and kind of be recharged up by being in a larger context of human beings, or maybe take a walk in the forest. Some people are not going to want to drive to the zoo because of some of the reasons we talked about earlier. Yeah, so like I think when I'm working with Jews who are interested in kind of doing some of their own, if you will, formation, you giving people the opportunity to experiment with different Shabbat practices is important to me, and I think can give them some nice opportunities. Like, how in such a money-driven society do we know that for 25 hours a week we're absolutely not spending money, or how in the time where we social media bombards us and this kind of fear of missing out kind of culture exists. How do we go more internal and be alone, or with our families or with our communities, without feeling like we're out there creating, rather we're recharging in that island in time, if you will. So to go back to maybe where we started, like I think the question of what kinds of things do we have in our lives that we might stop one day a week, also gives us a chance to think about what's important and kind of what we bring into the next week. Because sometimes when we stop something, we also have a chance to ask ourselves if it's something that we want to start again. So those are some frames. I think there's a lot of time for questions, so I can pause there, and maybe people have things that they're thinking about that we can talk about as a group.
Rabbi Klein, thank you so much for your inspiring talk about Sabbath and so many ideas that we're perhaps at least unfamiliar with in some ways. So please, all of you, if you have questions, you're welcome to ask. Ideas, thoughts? Yes, it looks like Otto's hand is up. Dan, maybe too? Cynthia?
Mine was too.
Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi Jason. That was a really good. It helped me give more full meaning to Shabbat, because it's not so different. Those are traditions we can take for ourselves. I mean, what I got is not only is it stopping or resting, but it's stopping, it's reflecting, it's remembering. It's a time to give thanks. It's a time to look at traditions, where we came from through food and activities, but it's also a transitional time to stop and think about what's coming next. It's so rich with possibilities that I think we'd like to practice that a lot more. And also, I think it's interesting that you presented, it takes time to prepare to stop. You have to think about, what will I do without on that day? What do I need to prepare so that I don't have to, I can get off the treadmill and stop and reflect. And the second point that you gave me, we just finished reading a book in our book group on Native American braiding sweetgrass, and their tradition that she presented, the author, was that humans came last, and we have a lot more to learn from what came before than what it's not like we weren't last because we're best, we're last because we have to learn from those things. So I picked up a lot from what you said, and I really appreciate all that. I hope I didn't miss any key points, but that's what I walked away with. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Cynthia or Dan, I think I saw your hands, maybe some others as well. Cynthia, yes, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say and you referred to Dr. Heschel, of course, and in his wonderful book on the Sabbath, his last words, eternity utters a day. I've always loved that, but he and others, of course, have, and the biblical authors as well, have connected Shabbat to justice. Can you say just a bit more about that? About how,
Sure. I mean, I think symbolically, there's this idea that Shabbat is a foretaste of the world to come. So a world in which everybody could actually observe Shabbat, have 25 hours a week to regroup, to eat delicious meals, to be with their family, to feel safe, I would say is inherently a world of universal justice and peace. So I think to that degree, Shabbat is a symbol of that. I mean, this idea of a foretaste of a better world. I think practically speaking, it's also a time for us to be internal, to kind of go internal, to do the work of replenishing. The end of the passage I read, the Exodus passage, Exodus 31, right? It's on the seventh day, God stopped, and I'm going to write this in the chat box because maybe it'll sound strange, but just to, God stopped and God souled God's self. Can we use the word soul, S-O-U-L, as a verb? I'm using it, but this word like nefesh, right? Like that's one of the Hebrew words for souls, and pretty much all the Hebrew words for soul are connected in their origin to breath, to breathing, right? Not unlike anima in Latin or pneuma in Greek, like, right, we see this across sacred traditions. And sometimes this word nefesh for soul is also used to just even refer to like a being, like a human being. But I think this lesson of God souling God's self, if you will, is a lesson that can teach us that we need to restore ourselves in order to spend the rest of the week doing the work to make the world a better place. So I think that's, for me, the other part of justice is sort of like how do we as human beings who, in my estimation, whose task is to leave the world a better place than we found it, how do we do the self-care to then continue to do that work?
So I had two things. One is I'm intrigued with your concept that God stopped creation after 6 days. I don't believe that. I'm pretty sure that COVID-19 wasn't created a long time ago. I believe creation's an ongoing thing. But the more important thing I wanted to hear is you were talking about this triangle of the creation, and then the revelation, and then ultimately the redemption. So is the revelation, I believe, I don't know, what was your concept of the revelation? It's more than just the handing down of the law at Mount Sinai, right? It's more than, it wasn't the covenant that God made with Noah, and then the covenant God made with Abraham, and then the sealing of the Takana, and then the additional writings that are continuing even up to this day, right? Is that what the revelation is, or?
I think there's, so first of all, I appreciate what you said about ongoing creation. There is this idea, we see it in our morning prayers. The first formalized prayer in the morning is a prayer that's kind of a play on the book of Isaiah, acknowledging God as the creator of light, the fashioner of darkness. And in that prayer, we hear this idea of renewing the work of creation every day. So certainly there's not this idea that creation just happened once. I think there's also this idea that we are partners in that creation as human beings. So yeah, I'm sorry. As far as revelation, there's this traditional Jewish idea, first of all, that the entire Jewish people was standing at Mount Sinai past, present, and future, so that there's a sense that much like the Exodus, that like we were there, and that these things are personalized in each generation. There's also this idea that when the Torah was revealed at Mount Sinai, that wasn't simply the 5 books of Moses, but that it was everything. So this very conversation we're having right now was revealed at Sinai, right? In that, the way that I understand kind of that, the way that idea is played with. And I think that's very beautiful to imagine, and not necessarily like a predestination lens, but just kind of an idea that revelation is always ongoing, and it's a matter of kind of tapping into it. So yes, down to your point, like the rabbinic tradition, the idea that there might be certain boundaries and frameworks and revisiting of historic legal things to understand them in different ways in different eras. All of this, I like to imagine as part of the ongoing nature of revelation.
I see that Jill's hand is up as well. So thank you. You've been waiting for a question, I think.
Unmute. Okay, I can lower my hand too after. I don't know how to do that right now. So Rabbi Jason and all, I am thinking about how, at least at St. John's, we've really been pondering and considering what it is we want to keep around, that we've learned during the pandemic and during the time that we had to be away from one another and had to meet on Zoom. And the things you shared with us this morning have really brought many of those to mind. So I just wanted to throw that out there, and particularly when you referenced 39 ways to keep Shabbat, and 39 ways, that's a lot of ways. And then ways to rejoice and be glad and delight in creation and being with one another. Those two they can be together or they can be distinct things. So I just wanted to throw out there that that's something that our community is considering, and I'm guessing it's happening in your community as well as we end with humanity. And I just wanted to remember quickly that when the pandemic started and we were all concerned about how we were going to do Easter, but Passover came first, and it was like just hearing and learning how Jewish families came together and figured out ways to honor and keep Passover in the face of not being able to gather together. That was very palpable to me. Yes, it was on social media and on the television, but I'm just in the space of this conversation thinking about that. And so I just wanted to throw that in.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, and I think I appreciate what you're saying about things we don't do, 39 categories of labor, if you will, and the things we do. And I also wonder, just like from an arithmetic perspective, in this very busy world with very busy lives and the tethering to devices and all this that we have, if part of what's helpful in this framework is to think about what we're not doing. Because if we don't stop doing something, then it's harder. Mathematically, it's harder to start doing something else. So if we have children at home and we feel like we're not giving them the attention we want to give them during the week, but can do so on the weekends, like what is it that we're literally like putting aside to make sure that we're doing that? Because otherwise, I think we end up in a situation where it's kind of half-hearted. Maybe not half-hearted. Maybe the intention is good, but the actual amount of attention we give might not be what we want it to be. Other thoughts or comments, Mark? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. You've given us a great deal to consider here, and I'm deeply appreciative of it. I'm wondering if you could comment a bit more on what I want to call the the attitude that you yourself might have, or that you find within your communities as the Sabbath approaches. And what's on my mind here is, in Heschel's wonderful book, his daughter has this brief introduction in which she puts forward this image for her readers of herself as a young girl, anticipating the Sabbath. And it's such a beautiful set of images that she summons about seeing the sunset over the Hudson River and the sort of flurry of activity before the Sabbath begins, and then how everything shifts when the Sabbath itself is upon her family and her community. And what it does for me, I mean, first of all, that book just exercised enormous power over my imagination. I mean, it's with me on a regular basis. Many of Heschel's phrases are just so powerful. But that part in particular shifts an attitude that it seems like some of us might have toward the Sabbath, which might be seeing it as something onerous, seeing it as something that's required, commanded, something that's difficult to do, and really, who has the time, to be honest? That kind of mentality. With Susanna Heschel's words, one gets an image of anticipation and excitement at the approaching Sabbath, because of what it means for herself with her family, the intimacy of that time with her family, and a real shift in the way in which they're going to engage the next 25 hours. And you gave us some compelling images as well. Whatever happens during the week, you've got the Sabbath there at the end. I mean, it seems to me, to be honest, that we have quite a bit to learn from our Jewish brothers and sisters on this, who seem to just do so much better on the Sabbath than we, at least many Christians do. So I don't know, just further thoughts from you about what's on your mind as the Sabbath approaches, your attitude, any further images that you could give us to compel us to maybe take it a little bit more seriously than some of us. I shouldn't speak so broadly than I myself manage to do on a regular basis.
Sure.
So I'll leave it at that.
No, I mean, look, I think, everyone's on a journey, and I'm certainly not going to paint the Jewish community in blanket terms about how seriously, how much Shabbat feels like the fulcrum for every single Jew of whatever 13 however many Jews are in the world. And interestingly, to Jill's point, I think the pandemic itself, I've had a lot of congregants at Temple Israel report back on how Shabbat has become more important to them in the pandemic, because it has allowed them to be more aware of time. And perhaps some of you have worked from home during the pandemic and noticed that the boundary between work and the rest of your life has, in case it perhaps hadn't existed before, really didn't exist. I just remember at some point, during those early first few months, just kind of, it's like 10 o'clock, and sometimes I worked at 10 o'clock in normal times, but then it's midnight. So they're just what was the thing that was going to get me to stop? So I think in that way, I was very grateful to have Shabbat, if nothing else. I think for me, one of the challenges I think of living in the American diaspora, or opportunities, right, is that Friday tends to be a work day. So sort of when do you actually prepare? And most Jewish organizations will close early on Friday, to allow people to finish preparing for Shabbat. But then there's also a bit of a recovery day in terms of Sunday being a quieter weekend day, right? In Israel, Friday is kind of a full to kind of half day, and then Shabbat is Shabbat, and then the work week begins again on Sunday. So yeah, some employers expect that you're gonna drag in an hour late or whatever on Sunday morning, but that's day one. And so I think sometimes, so one of the things I think about just when I'm anticipating Shabbat, I've certainly been to Israel many times. I lived there just for a year in rabbinical school, is kind of how we actually spend Shabbat in such a way that we're prepared for the rest of the week without the Sunday in front of us. So, as this kind of American convenience, but then it makes it more challenging on the other end, right, to do the preparations. I think for me, right, in an ideal week where, and again, COVID has kind of made this challenging, but if I'm actually spending time cooking and knowing people are going to come over, that is exciting to me, adds a certain amount of anticipation. Here in the, in the summer here in Minneapolis, the idea that like the sun doesn't go down until between 8 and 9 o'clock, also means I have more time to actually cook and maybe even vacuum the carpets once before friends came over, for instance, this past Friday night. I think that the idea that there like is a moment, right, and like most kind of traditional communities have some sort of again, a little bit of a boundary. The prevalent tradition in the diaspora, or at least in America, is to light Shabbat candles 18 minutes before the sun goes down, so that there's a bit of a boundary between when it would be forbidden from a traditional perspective of lighting candles. But there's a certain kind of, it's funny because, with this idea of anticipation, I wonder whether, I don't know whether it's, are we causing ourselves extra stress to then de-stress, or is it actually a way to be mindful of the pressures that there are kind of at every moment in life, and actually by knowing that there's a meal to prepare for, other things around the house that maybe you're prepared before Shabbat, that's its own perhaps mindfulness practice. I mean, certainly the image that you're describing, to some degree happens in New York, in other places with significant Jewish communities, right? In most communities in Israel, you hear kind of a Shabbat siren at the time that at candle lighting time, so people know when to light candles if they don't have it written down. Most people kind of know because there's calendars for these things. But like I think in the in the open air vegetable and fruit market in Jerusalem, right? That's another space where you can really experience this on Friday afternoon. What's the boundary between the shopkeeper, like how far long can they keep their shop open before they have to close it and get home before Shabbat? That's another place where I really love kind of feeling that in the air. Looks like we're getting close to the end of our time, so maybe if there's one short question we can finish, and otherwise, thanks for having me this morning.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Klein, for your inspiring and meaningful presentation this morning. We're really grateful you were able to make it and join us this morning, and we would love to have you come again if you're able to do that.
I would be honored.
Thank you so much. A reminder that worship virtually begins at 10 o'clock this morning with a link through the church's website. You're also welcome to join us next week in person worship for our services, or virtually, of course. And our Faith Formation Hour next week will feature Dr. Judy Stack, who will speak about rest and Sabbath in the Christian tradition as well. So we look forward to that. Let us end with a prayer. Loving God, you created the Sabbath. Teach us how to rededicate ourselves to Sabbath in ways that will renew and inspire us, so that we may seek holy and loving purpose in every other day of the week. We pray for people of all faiths, for our guest presenter, and for Rabbi Glazer, who was unable to join us today. May all work toward mutual understanding and peace, renewed through Sabbath. So, amen. And I think I can say to all of you, for us at least, and next week to you, Rabbi, Shabbat Shalom.